So this is an inexact science, getting this thing to start. It tells me Zoom is dumping it on YouTube now. So as soon as my screen lights up with some sign of life, we'll get started.
Okay. It's yeah, can you, I was about to ask if you guys can hear the rain.
No, I can't hear it.
Oh,
It is raining, yeah. It's
okay.
raining pretty hard on and off, so I was worried you guys but you guys can't hear the rain?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
No.
Good.
So John Rose and JP, just let me just welcome you, since we're sitting here on broadcasting this thing, or who knows whether anybody will ever tune in, but if they do, they're going to know we expected them. Anyway, welcome. So let's see. We've spent a couple of times now trying to do this live. This is sort of like a living room conversation that we decided to happening first on Zoom, and then why not on YouTube? And why not let other people come in? Why not let other people listen in? And maybe eventually, why not invite people actually into the project, the Resurrecting Civility project? So if you're not one of the three of us who expected to be here, and you found your way in through the courtesy of some YouTube algorithm or some friend who invited you, welcome. I'm Tom Loughran, philosopher in the physics department at Notre Dame. I'm going to stop making that introduction one of these days. And this is the third time we've tried to do this live. With me are John Rose and John Loughran. I'm privileged to be uncle to both of these fine gentlemen. So thanks, guys. Thanks again for coming in.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah. I enjoyed our conversation last time. We talked, we explored the question of how is it exactly that various topics come to be so polarized? How is it that those topics end up with such different points of view about them? And what are some of the forces operating in that? And what are the well springs of disagreement, really? And what are some of the environments that heighten that disagreement? And that was pretty fun. And we looked at a number of things. I actually came out of it with a little bit better sense of, I thought at the end of our conversation, once you acknowledge that corporate media might try to stir various positions into a frenzy for a profit motive, whether it's broadcast media or social media, and once you put that aside, you see there's plenty of room for disagreement, whether or not they help. There's plenty of room, lots of very difficult questions, and we looked at some of them last time, and I'm looking forward to get to that again. Any thoughts from either of you in your reminiscence? You've been thinking about it since we hung up, so to speak.
Nothing too much to add for me, I don't think. Maybe I could definitely return to some of those questions another Wednesday, though. I think that'd be fun.
Good.
Yeah, I had that same thought. I think it'd be worthwhile to go back and look at that transcript and see what sort of avenues emerge for just continuing to work in the same vein. Yeah.
Good. Well, let's do it. Let's see here. I have shared a screen, which I think you all see. Is that true?
Yes.
Cool. And it's, you can see, I was hoping we would get to information processing this evening. And just for a while, maybe a bit less long on a Saturday evening than we took the last couple of times. That's particularly true for the first session, which went pretty long. If I knew how to introduce this stuff, I might be doing it differently. I mean, this really is throwing the curtains open, letting people into our sort of our living room conversation about this stuff. And we'll make our way through a lot of material. And last time I tried, I think pretty inartfully to introduce what it was we're up to. I want to get at it a little bit differently today, mostly because I had some things stuck in my craw and I played with a few graphics, which I'd like to use. Here they are. There's a couple of them here. They all look kind of alike. This is just sort of a whole. Yeah.
Is there any way you could full screen the slide? Like I'm looking at a bunch of, I'm looking at like the master view.
Oh,
is there any way you can just make the slide go full screen?
Yeah, I can do that. And let's see, I have a couple of options there.
I mean, maybe presenter view in the bottom right.
Here comes one of them. Yeah, I'm not, sorry, my box is in there. And I realized, John, you're on an iPhone. So
yeah,
less than an ideal environment for viewing graphics.
Well, I just think if it's going to be what people see on YouTube, I feel like you probably just want the slide up. And
could be. Let's try that. And unfortunately, in order to get that, I know exactly how to get it. I've just got competing technologies, one of which is sitting on top of another, so I can't quite get to. I think what I have to do actually is hit escape, pull this down, and now I ought to be able to see. Yeah, here we go. Pulling up my slideshow menu. And that didn't help me a lot.
It looked like it showed up for a second. There it is.
All right. Yep, here it is.
Play from play from current slide. Yeah.
Got it. See if that helps.
There we go.
Nice. Yeah.
Now you hit the button on your iPhone and turn it into a tablet, right? Or something. that would be a different technology, different year.
I could figure something out like that. I have a Microsoft Surface that maybe I could, if I hotspotted my phone, maybe I could do it like a tablet. Anyway, I'll figure that out on my own.
Yeah. Cool. We should point out to those who are to our listening audience of 0 that we should point out that you're in a car in a hot spot out in the hills of Oregon, where in a spot that actually gets reception.
Yeah.
So
getting back on the grid.
Yeah.
A little bit of a drive.
Yeah. All right. Well, here we are. This is a little holding tank for some images, and I'm going to play with them. You can see one of them has got some computer screens, and it says it's a mesh topology. The one that's up here on the left upper corner, that is a sort of an original slide. Oops, back please. This one at the top left is, I just grabbed from a Wikipedia article. You'll see why I wanted to have some transparency. This one is actually a screen grab of it. And this one came from Network Theory. or graph theory, I should say, an article on graph theory. And I thought I'd put them together, and you can see that I've sort of done that in a number of efforts there, but let me walk you through them one at a time. And these are nodes that are connected with edges. We could think of them in that language if we were, nodes connected with edges. And I replaced some of the nodes with another little network, literally just copying them and pasting them, smaller versions. And I did that because I wanted to get to this slide. I wanted to find a way to graphically represent for a moment. Here, all the blue dots, there are very small ones and then the much larger versions, and they all represent, you can call them nodes, but when they're very small, they're persons, and when they're larger, they're communities of persons. And the black connections are just meant to represent information flowing between nodes. This happens to be a 7-node graph, and there's nothing special about 7. And every node is connected to every other node in this particular drawing, and there's nothing special about that. This, I suppose, would come close to representing a group of peers, all of whom know one another and all of whom have relationships with one another and learn from one another. And in a simple group like that, you could imagine that this is not a ridiculous representation. Other times, you could imagine an expert where lots of students learn from that expert, and then the drawing wouldn't be quite like this. The information would travel differently and would be, there'd be a hub somewhere in the middle, more like a star than this configuration. But here, the smaller groups are meant to suggest the idea of rich communities. These are networks of persons where information flows between folks. And as we talked about last time, you could imagine in a small group, you might have a lot in common with a lot of people that you're connected to. If that number is small enough for you to basically have trusting relationships with these folks, so that you are something like peers, you're alike. And in that environment, you could imagine that that experience gained by one person gets transferred to other people, maybe just through storytelling or through reporting channels, or there's all kinds of different ways in different kinds of organizations. And you could parallel process a job in that way if you're like one another. And now in a larger group, you could imagine that these communities are actually talking to one another and sharing information one to another. You wouldn't expect the structure to be exactly the same, but here again, the structure is just sort of, it's just structure. It's shorthand for there is some structure, right? And something like that. So then maybe this is what a high information flow network of rich communities could be modeled as to a very, very first graphic approximation. Where these are a community of communities or a society of communities or a network of communities at this large level. And then at these smaller levels, these are people who are interacting in a community. But let me step a little further. This one actually doesn't help me very much, except to point out that this is a mesh topology. You could put computers together this way. Or I suppose you could put a motherboard together this way, where you have different processing units, right? All of whom talk to one another, peer to peer in this sort of way. But let me shift gears to another use. This is not one we've talked about yet, and you can tell I've got the brain in mind. So imagine just laying one of these 7-node networks on top of the other to get a stack of 6 of them. And here's the 6 of them in red. And if you did that, you can imagine that it's a little bit like the neocortex in a brain, because it turns out that our neocortex, this drawing actually comes from some other primate, this particular one, but I'm going to suggest that it's got 6 layers to it, and this is what neuroscientists tell us. And this is true, I think, in general in mammalian brains. This particular version of what's connected to what came from an article on some other primate.
Structure is probably conserved.
I think so, but the size is not. So it turns out we've got a lot of neocortex. Human beings do a lot more than other primates, other mammals. We've got enough neocortex, and there's a fellow named Jeff Hawkins who wrote a book called On Intelligence, who carries around with him a dinner napkin to illustrate this context, a very big dinner napkin. You know, I don't know what a dinner napkin is. 16 inches by 16 inches, maybe. It's a little bigger than a foot, or 18. And imagine a really thick dinner napkin. If you want to get the neocortex, you got to get it about 3 millimeters thick. And it does vary a little bit, I understand, in the brain, but roughly somewhere between 2 and 3 millimeters in thickness. That's, as he says, that's a stack of about 6 business cards, if you want to see it. If you stack 6 business cards together, you get something that looks like this, and that's roughly a representation. So here are then 7 of these stacks represented by my arbitrarily 7-fold nodal network here. So maybe you could use this to represent, for our purposes, just one brain. These are 7 cortical columns of neocortex shown then, if you put them on top of each other. In our human brains, there would be many tens of thousands of these cortical columns. And Jeff Hawkins argues, I think he still stands by this, although his book on intelligence is a bit older. I'm trying to remember the year it came out, but it's quite a number of years old now. But he's still working hard on this theory, and he's got a company. Maybe you know that Jeff Hawkins, maybe you don't know this, created the Palm Pilot. The Palm Pilot was a very early handheld device. My wife and I actually owned a pair of those once back in the day. And he has really specialized in trying to do something like theoretical neuroscience, is the way he describes it. And he thinks there isn't actually a lot of theoretical neuroscience going on, and he's always wanted to fix that. He wrote On Intelligence to try to lay out the fundamentals of theoretical neuroscience. And I think in general, people receive that book reasonably well. They may think that there's all kinds of amendments to it, and there's all kinds of other credit because other people were doing different things. With all of those caveats, I think people receive that book pretty well. And Hawkins at least thinks it's still a pretty good model. And he has got a team called Numenta. And Numenta is working on both computational science, both AI really, and machine learning and various paradigms there, trying to learn from the brain. And he thinks that's the way it needs to go, actually. Hawkins does. And his team sort of buys into that. Anyway, he's got a theory, he calls it the 1,000 brain theory. Why call it 1,000 brains? Well, he thinks that's because while we have many tens of thousands of these, and I'm sure I'm getting the number wrong, but not by many orders of magnitude. Maybe it's another order of magnitude. Maybe it's hundreds of thousands of these cortical stacks in this napkin-sized entity. This napkin, by the way, as you all know, sort of lays on the outside of the brain, of the subcortical brain, and it's folded up. That's how you get that whole napkin in your head. It's folded up into various kinds of pouches. In fact, some of those are represented here. Let me just move this. And I think you can see them better. Folded up like so. There is notably a big dividing line. You cut that napkin in half, I suppose. in the two hemispheres. And then those two hemispheres have got four major parts, the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal, which is sort of wrap around the brain. And all of that sits on top of the subbrain, which I sort of have the subcortical parts of the brain. Sometimes this is known as the old brain on the inside, as opposed to the new brain, which is this new, that is in mammalian evolution, and particularly new in us, where our evolution has really taken off and given us this much more of this neocortex than others. The cool thing about it, sorry about that, guys. Do you have a set of lions on your show, or what is it you see?
We're still on the same slide with the stacks.
You are, okay, good. And I've unfortunately got myself stuck in a mode I can't get out of. There it is. Good. The thousand brain theory is based on an analysis that Hawkins' group does, in which of tens of thousands or more, it's many more than tens of thousands actually. There's only a number of them operating at once, and it might be as many as 1,000 of them that are operating at once. And the phrase they use there is sparseness. It's a sparse architecture. It's an architecture in which most of the parts are unused at any one time. And so of the great many more of these that we actually have in our brain, there might be 1,000 of them operating at roughly that order of magnitude at any one time. And what's interesting in Hawkins' analysis, and we'll look at this a little bit more down the road when its time comes, but I wanted to introduce it just up front because it is something like a community of, I don't think he uses that phrase, but it certainly uses, it's a network of independent agents. In fact, across the entire neocortex, he thinks there's basically the same algorithm at work inside these basic units, which are these cortical columns. And the phrase neoplasticity is used in neuroscience to suggest that it turns out you can get any part of the brain to do the work of the other parts of the brain, even though, given the way our sensory input is wired into the brain, and given the way these various cortical columns and other parts of the brain are wired up one to another. There is a lot of specialization in the brain. There's a great deal of specialization. And so back here, for example, you got the sensory regions at the back, and even those there are subspecialties within even the visual region. There's subspecialties. I could get into trouble really fast saying much about neuroscience, but this is what they say. And even though that specialization takes place, it takes place because of the way these individual parts are wired up inside, the very parts inside the columns, inside the various neurons that are inside, the way that they're wired one to another, and the way that they're wired outside of these cortical columns as well to other pieces, other parts of the brain. And that's where specialization comes from. But there is a common cortical algorithm that's working everywhere. And because that's the case, it turns out that we are parallel processing all the time in our own brain. And in fact, it's as if we've got 1,000 of them working at any given time on any given sensory construct, any given problem. Hence the 1,000 brain theory. It's that we've got 1,000 working at any given time. Go ahead.
It seems like that would be a pretty inefficient way to run the brain. I mean, because it's not like, like you said, it does run sort of sparsely, right? Like only 1,000 of the 100,000 would be running at a time. But there are regions that are specialized for particular regions, like,
right.
And so, that region does do something in particular, right?
Yep.
So is it like in that particular region there's parallel processing going on?
I think the answer is yes.
Throughout the brain, because it seems like it'd be in the
I think the
particular
answer is
region.
both. I think the answer is both, and it probably depends upon the particular functioning. That is, what exactly is being processed.
Right.
And there are cells that are so specific. This is in the news these days. I'm trying to remember the name of the actress. What's her name? But they've named a certain cell after her, Jennifer Aniston cells. And those are cells which light up, right? If you happen to have a Jennifer Aniston cell, and you have one, apparently, not if you just met her once, but if she has become sort of a thing that you know. Yeah. If Jennifer Aniston is a thing in your mind. And if that's the case, right, then when you see, you might see an article about her, you might see her name in black and white, you might see it in lights, you might see her in a movie, you might see credits at the end. All of those stimuli will, as a matter of fact, light up your Jennifer Aniston cells. Maybe a neuron, or maybe it's more than one neuron. I haven't actually followed the details of that. But
so is that just for anything you learn? Anything particular thing you learn, you have a particular neuron for it?
I think the answer is no for that. In fact, I think it's the case, from what I can tell, anytime you
just Jennifer Aniston
all the time, you're going to be wrong in the brain, because there's an awful lot of complex functioning going in there. There's a lot of ways that the brain skins the cat, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so it will really depend upon, sometimes it depends on who you are. Even it depends, for example, when an expert learns versus a novice learns, and they're doing the very same thing, but the expert sort of sees differently, because the brain has, through a whole series of processing, has sort of it has developed concepts at higher levels and pushed them down into lower levels. Here, I don't mean lower levels of cortical columns. I mean here, lower levels of something like reasoning architecture, something like that.
More efficient algorithms.
Yeah, more efficient algorithms. That's right. So you might even be looking at the same thing, and the two brains are not working the same.
Yeah.
And that's true, not just because of, that's true anyway, because there's biochemical individuality in the brain. Even amongst peers doing the very same thing at the same time, their brains may not work exactly the same, but it's true of one individual to the same individual later in time as they gain expertise.
Yeah. But the main thing is parallel processing in the brain.
There's a parallel processing dimension to it, which is interesting. And if we were talking about community, we might make a lot more of this. He uses the example of a cup, and he says, you've got lots of cortical columns that are all figuring out independently. I shouldn't say independently, because because that's an absolute. And it's the one thing the clue I'm getting about brain science is that you don't want to speak in absolutes, because it's a highly particular, you know, the way people code, and sometimes they may code, but for the sake of efficiency, they don't loop in the very same way, and they sort of reach out, and they kind of, the code reaches out to a specific region of hardware sometimes, right? And then brings something back from that specific region of hardware. Why? Because it's just a lot faster if you do it that way. Well, those kinds of moves that coders make, the brain apparently makes in spades. So never say never, almost never say never, I suppose, is a consistent way to say that. But I think the same way, something similar is true. And now I forget the question you asked. Is it? but it required.
I think we answered it. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, all I wanted to do here in this early stage is just to introduce the idea that, your brain is wired too, and it gets lots of inputs, just like a person gets lots of inputs, and your neighbor gets lots of inputs, and we could talk about those together like we are now. Right. And we could be a small network of, say, 7 of us in a small but we might represent that as a community in some way. And yet there are other folks who are very, very different than we are. And that's what we were sort of thinking through when we go back a model. Go back a model? Oh, I clicked out of PowerPoint, sorry. We're gonna go back a second, right? And here we were representing persons and exchange between persons. And then we were representing communities as a whole and exchange between communities.
Yeah.
Right. At the same time, something similar like that is going on in the brain, only the units are not persons, they are neurons. Or maybe they're not neurons, maybe they're cortical stacks. And that's not enough said, because the brain does not consist just of our neocortex, right? It's very much more complicated than that.
Yeah. Some analogous structure at least.
But it's interesting. Suppose we just then represent persons, remembering that there's brains in those persons. And so I've slotted in a stack of 6 for each of the persons in this little 7-member community. One community represented by 7 persons, each with one brain. And remembering that those brains themselves have got information processing, they're also networks. And in fact, it may be the case that cortical columns are an important unit if we wanted to understand persons. Now, if we did that here, we might remind ourselves again that we represented a high information flow network of rich communities in a very similar sort of model as we could represent a person in a community. Right.
Yeah.
And then you could put all these things together in one drawing if you wanted to. And I think I'm asking PowerPoint to do that now. And it just turns out these are big graphics. Give me a second. Yeah, I went too far. Okay. So now I put them all together. So you've got these 6 layered, that whatever looks like it's the smallest unit on here is actually a 6-layered network, representing a brain, representing a person. And then you've got persons linked together in communities and communities linked together in networks, or maybe in a high information flow network of rich communities, to use that language, or we could just say a society.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting, right now, this is just an analog, that if Hawkins' 1,000 brain theory is right, and it turns out I've got a lot of cortical columns at work trying to come up with an account of what these things are. And these things, it turns out, even when they're behind my head, are known to me to be glasses, right? And there's a sensory dimension, there's memory, there's general concepts I have. I'm not surprised when I feel something like this. I know what glasses are. In fact, I know I sometimes read in this very spot. All of those kinds of memories come together. So do my visual inputs. All of those things are pouring in, and out comes an account, right? It's an account, and it's an account of glasses. And maybe that happens all over the brain in multiple places. And maybe the brain, in effect, votes and comes up with the most plausible account. And how that happens is a really good question for Jeff Hawkins. And maybe we'll listen to him sometime. Right? It's not a good question for me, but it's an analogy. Something like that is going on in the brain. Whether Hawkins is right about it, or it's a different model, certainly that there are a lot of various pieces that are networked together and that have, what are the numbers? I wish I remember this, but I think it's something like 20 million visual pathways or something. I think it's on that order of magnitude. And I think it's much smaller for our other senses. Altogether, I think it's half of what our visual senses have. But the point is, we got lots of information flowing in, and it's getting processed in there, and it's getting processed by parts, and a lot of those parts repeat themselves. And gosh, doesn't it start to look like inside the brain, we're dealing with the same sort of challenge. And yet, what do you know? Out comes me, and out comes you with an opinion about what the hell these are, right? In spite of this enormous cacophony of information flowing in and being processed in all kinds of different ways, I think in parallel and by different units. Maybe it's these cortical columns are among those important units. And we come out with a single opinion. And it's very interesting. So do communities sometimes. So you could imagine all these people working a problem. I just recently watched have you guys seen this movie? If you haven't, watch it. Look it up and watch it. It is it's AlphaGo actually beating the Go champion. And they put together a really nice, what's the word when the movie's actually true?
Documentary?
Documentary, thank you. We're a community, and now we all know that. Exactly. But they put together a very nice documentary, and there's a whole team. AlphaGo, it turned out, was quite a team, a pretty remarkable team. And you see them all interacting with one another, bringing their various specializations together and putting this thing together. And in a certain sense, what AlphaGo does, or what that team does when that team says they're ready, who is it that knows that? What's the rational basis for that claim that they're ready now to go up against this champion? It's as if that team as a whole is making a decision, and there's nobody, I think it's fair to say, at that level of specialization. While there are people who know what all the various components, there may not even be a single person who knows, it may be a team, a small team, right, who knows what all the experts underneath it all grasp. At least they get the main conclusions drawn there. They don't necessarily know all the reasons, not on any large team, right? Think of it, gosh, even putting a movie together is like that. Just look at the credits. When do you get to see a team laid out? At the end of a movie credits, you get to see if you hang around for them. But we can say sometimes that an organization does things. The organization put the movie out. The organization even holds an opinion, right? This is our team's recommendation. And our team might be very, very deep. And there might be nobody who knows the whole thing, but our team nonetheless is networked together such that there's a single output. That's interesting. And you might even say a community knows how to get certain things done. You could imagine a community knowing something that not any of the individuals in the community know entirely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's interesting. So that's true of the brain. I think something, and it's got all these parts working for me. And in the end, it comes out and it's just my opinion. And it seems to be something like that seems to be true inside a community or inside an organization if it's wrapped tightly enough, right, to produce a single opinion. Not all organizations are, but sometimes it might be, and you might have a certain output. You could imagine a society wired that way too.
Yeah.
Imagine that communities got together and gave their input. Maybe they specialize in different things. And now you could imagine maybe there's something that society as a whole knows. Could you imagine saying, for example, that this society knows how to bring its various competing groups together in a decision-making process? And that's something the society as a whole knows. You might say that. I don't know how they do it, because it's really hard to do apparently these days, right? But you could imagine a society who didn't suck at that.
Yeah.
And it could be that the craft is different in one community than another community because they see this challenge differently in one community than another community. But they nonetheless respond in a whole conversation. And somehow they figure it out together. And you could say of that society even that it knows something that goes beyond. It's a single thing that that society as a whole knows. It's a society level capability.
Yeah.
It's a know-how, it's a craft, but it's sort of built through the organization of all these different communities who are in turn built together out of all these individual persons in their communities who are in turn built together from all of this various conceptual framework, right, which is somehow grounded in biology in our brains.
Yeah.
That little tour we just took is another way of introducing the challenge of this project, this Resurrecting Civility challenge, which we hemmed and hawed and introduced as, in one way, a couple of episodes back.
Well, I think you can take it even deeper, because sometimes our our senses disagree with one another sometimes in the case of different illusions, right? So sometimes our brains don't even necessarily agree, and it's a really high information flow network, you know.
Yeah.
So I think the analogy can go even deeper. And then, I mean, vision is our most convincing sense, and it can overcome proprioception, for example. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like that adds depth and interest, adds depth to the analogy even more, because,
I think it does.
you know, our brains aren't perfect communities.
Mhm.
No, that's right. In fact, even your eyes, even your vision, right? Your eyes move, what is it? Is it 3 times a second? Your eyes posture. And there is also there's also a rate that you take in, and it's somewhere in the order of motion pictures work. I think it's 75 hertz, and they get away with that because we can't quite pick up 75 hertz. So our brains work a little less fast than that, right? Where they're constantly refreshing.
Yeah.
But it's more than 3 hertz. Our eyes literally change position every 3 hertz, but even in the same position, we're getting a different visual story, which is why sometimes we look at something, it takes us a while to figure out what we see, right? So which story is canonical? Which story is the right story? Maybe there isn't a right story. Maybe we're constructing it from all of this various input. Brains are even more coolly, now's a nice time to point out that most of our perception is actually prediction, which is not something people used to know about brains, but you probably have heard that. You know, it's kind of neuroscience 101, and how much of it is prediction. And sometimes people say as much as 90% of our taking the world in is verifying the predictions we have already made about what we're about to see. And sometimes those predictions are verified, and most of the time they're verified. And it's because we make that prediction that we can basically speed up our grasp. If we couldn't speed up our grasp, we'd have been dead. The story goes now. And I don't know how much of that is true. I don't know what's different species by species, and how much of this is a human story, and how much of this is in other mammals, other vertebrates, etc. I don't know the answer of all that. But there too, you've got, do you agree with yourself? You've got this prediction, and then you've got this various input that's pouring in, right? That is either verifying or not verifying this prediction from one set of data or from a different set of data. And it's all your data. And maybe that's being processed, not, as Hawkins says, not just by different parts of the brain who are individually, although there are different parts of the brains that are specializing in different things, no question about that, right? But because of this or it's, I don't know, I could get into trouble here quickly. It's also the case that there's a plurality of processors in the brain who are processing the whole, says Jeff Hawkins. And I think he says, while that's a too simple rule, it's not especially a controversial rule at some level, I think. This is my impression of the field. What would I know? We'd have to bring a real expert in and hear them. But in any case, so we are ourselves not just a univocal.
Yeah.
Right? We've got many different voices, many different pieces, and so you were getting at that, John, JP, and I think you're right. But it's interesting. If we can come out with a single opinion, and there is apparently a biological craft, we've basically evolved to be able to do that. We don't, by the way, we use the expression, I'm of more than one mind about that. So sometimes we have not yet made up our mind. But the point is, sometimes we do. And then this is our view, and we stick by it. Right? It's my story, and I'm sticking to it. We have language for this.
Yeah.
And a community can do that. At least an organization can do that. Right? This is our team of attorneys. You guys were in mock trial, if I remember correctly. Right.
Yeah.
And this, what a zoo that is, right? Of 6 people who are very different from one another, but at some point you make decisions, and this is what your team does. Or you can imagine a legal team of a great many attorneys coming up with a single recommendation from that team. How is that possible? Well, it's actually not that hard. We know what those we know what those mechanisms look like. We don't know everything about them, but we see them all the time. And we say that this team has acted somehow as a whole. Then an organization could a whole community act as a whole? About how many things? Good question, right? That's sort of the question of what a community could become. How much could you take in? How much could you process? Could you process everything? Could you imagine a bunch of people that are sort of one mind about everything? You might not want to be.
I can't imagine that, but.
Right. You might not want to be. You might think that's terrible. On the other hand, it would be awfully nice. It'd be nice to have someone to talk to who actually knows a lot of the things, at least, that you know, and cares about a lot of the things that you care about. You could imagine richer sets of peers than we actually have. In fact, yeah. I think it's the case. This is a nice little model. Maybe I've used it with you before, but it seems to me that most of us are at the center, not of a network like this. Most of us do not belong in peer groups like this. We're mostly the center of a star. We are at the center of a star-shaped network, and there are various pieces that come out, and those various pieces connect us to people we trust about X.
Yeah.
That we may trust them to get dinner on at the same time, not to stab us in the back. We live with those people, right? That's a certain kind of a trust network. And there's a lot that we may actually have in common. There's a lot of trust in that network. But you might not take anyone's recommendation in your family for where to invest your money, right? There, you got another set of people. Right? And you call this company, and any of the people in that company will do because you trust the people in that company, right? But they're all kind of experts, and they've all had a kind of learning that you haven't had.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe other people in your family use them too, or maybe nobody does, but chances are your neighbor, who you also get along with, and you might actually think politically a lot alike with your neighbor, and sometimes you talk politics on your porches with your neighbors. You may have more in common with your neighbor than you do with all the rest of the people in your family. That's not impossible. Even though you trust those people in your family about a lot of things, you trust your neighbor more as a source of information about what's happening politically, because he's a right-thinking or she's a right-thinking person, according to you. But neither of you go to the same people for financial advice. You go to different people. So, and that's only a few of the great many. How many people do you know that you get information from? And how many people are just like you and go to all those sources of information? The answer is 0. No one else is exactly like you. In fact, maybe nobody else is very much like you. If you start to spill that ring of trust, that network of trust out, it's much more like you're at the center of this trust network. And you've got all these other things. And there are some people that you trust that have some of this in common with you. Nobody has everything in common with you. And not just everyone because you couldn't. I mean, you could imagine identical twins who live as synchronous swimming lives as is possible, and you would still have differences between them. Right. And
Yeah.
so, of course, that's the case. But I don't mean in that trivial sense where that's always the case. And that could be a very valuable sense, by the way. Those two identical twins may have very different thoughts, even though they've experienced an enormous amount of life together and have a lot of trustworthy networks together. They still, they're different people. It's a good question. What would it be like if there were a clone of you? All body, not just biological clone, but if you could clone your brain, and now there were two of you, boy, could you parallel process then. You would you could skip half your meetings, right? But you'd still have to come back, and you'd still have to debrief. There'd still have to be information flow. But now imagine 7 of those. Here's a nice model for that. That's a nice little community. And it's an enormously strong network of trust. And it would have an advantage in that you could trust that guy. That guy is you. The same way you trust what you did yesterday with what you do tomorrow. It's the same guy, and you remember what you did yesterday, and you take that information in, and it's up there. And it's not like you didn't trust yourself from 3 days ago. See what I mean? So extended across time, we are such a person almost, right? We're almost a community of time slices. And there's a lot of trust in that community. Not always, as you all know. Sometimes you don't trust yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wish Past John did a bunch of different stuff.
That's right.
That guy was an idiot.
Sure. Yeah. And he never liked that other guy, but maybe now you ought to go back and meet that guy because Past John was not a very reliable guy.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, why couldn't we get this whole damn thing to work well? That's just a really good question. I mean, it does work well at a lot of levels. We can get our brains to work better. We can get ourselves to work better as persons. We can get our communities to work better, at least in certain ways. We can get an organization to work together as a whole. Why can't we get a whole community to work together as a whole? What could communities do? Good question. But whatever they do, if they're going to parallel process, they're going to tend to be a little bit alike. Right? I mean, if they think the other person that they're processing with is a freaking idiot who knows nothing, you can't parallel process with that person. It would seem. You can't trust them.
Yeah, you wouldn't trust their information.
You wouldn't. Right. And then somehow we seem not to trust one another as communities either. Why the hell is that? Is it really something we couldn't get over? I'm asking some probing, skeptical questions here as another way of introducing this notion of how we process information. It's good that other people have different perspectives than us. That's what we think sometimes. Maybe they're probing a space that we don't probe, and maybe if we listen to them, we might see things from their point of view. Maybe we could even see ourselves from their point of view, which would give us a different way of looking at ourselves. Why isn't that valuable? Why isn't there a wiring for that, a social wiring for that?
Well, this reminds me of the part of the story of Us where there's the 3 different tribes, and tribe A is mean to everyone, even in group, and then tribe B is nice to the in group but mean to the out group, and tribe C is nice to the in group and out group, and then tribe A just kills itself, and then tribe B and tribe C meet, and tribe B wins because they just kill tribe C because tribe C tries to be nice. So it's not evolutionary. It's not evolutionarily advantageous to be nice to everyone else.
Right.
Maybe that's how we got this way.
Yeah.
John Rose, have you seen the Wait But Why blog?
Yeah, I read the first couple chapters.
Okay, of the story of us. Excellent.
So it seems like we need to get past that. Yeah.
Somehow we do seem to get past it in organizations, right? We actually have people we can work with.
Right.
I don't know, if you've got great examples or not, but you can imagine a team of coders, for example, right? And they're all working on the same project and they actually help one another. They actually have different expertise. I know some coders. They share code all the time. They float back. They do little peer checks all the time. And have another person, as you all know, if you've done a tiny bit of coding, you can miss a lot of details. You probably don't have stupid code when you start, but you could have nonetheless wrong code and you can't figure out how to fix it. That happens all the time. So having a second set of eyes, if they understand the language, is very useful, right? So there are a lot of times where we do want those kinds of relationships. We could build them. So somehow we get over it.
Yeah.
And in fact, he gets at that in this Wait But Why blog. So Tim Urban is the guy who Wait But Why. And since we're broadcasting this on YouTube, we ought to give credit where credit is due, right? Yeah. Tim Urban writes a tremendous amount of wonderful blogs. Today, it's very interesting. It was the SpaceX launch of, did you happen to watch it? If not, SpaceX actually put human beings in space. NASA.
So they finally launched today, huh?
They launched today, and it was a nice, beautiful thing. And they broadcast it live. They actually had live telecasting of the astronauts as they were undergoing 4G, whatever it is, that they go through, and it's worth watching. The reason I mention that is that Tim Urban Elon Musk called Tim Urban up once and said, "Hey, I want to tell my story and I'd kind of like you to write it." And so Urban wrote the story of Elon Musk, and he's done that a bunch of times, actually. As you know, Musk does a lot of things, a lot of cool things. Yeah. Neuralink, SpaceX, Tesla, to name three really current projects, and there are others, right? And he's got an MO, and it's a revolutionary MO, and Urban can tell you all about it. And so you ought to read Tim Urban on Elon Musk, for example. And this is just a commercial for Tim Urban's Wait But Why. But to our point, for our purpose here, he's written the story of us, and he does a very good job at digging through lots of different stuff. And John Rose, we're going to run into a lot of stuff in Tim Urban's work, and we ought to work through it with some care. Actually, we ought to spend some sessions. We ought to read the whole thing, and then we ought to spend some time. And I should reread it, because I had been keeping up with it as it comes out. I'd read it that week, but he's been working on it for a while now, so I'm behind on some of it. I mean, it's just been a while, and I need to refresh my memory. So, yeah, that is what he's getting at, is exactly our problem. It's our problem from a polarization point of view. We're going to look at other people who are getting at exactly our problem too. As I mentioned last time, we're going to look at social physics for a bit. And Sandy Pentland is the author of that work, and in general, that whole research team. And he thinks there is a new science that's available today, and he's getting at a lot of pieces too. And there are many others who are trying to figure out what are the new tools we have. What do we know about why we're in the shape that we're in, and what are the various tools that we have to bring to the table. And I'm utterly convinced that McIntyre is bringing tools to the table, which is why I began introducing this project, talking about McIntyre as long and as unfortunately unartfully as I did. But there's a lot of wonderful tools there, and they will actually blow us away. And so here's a new introduction then. This was a graphical information processing question. At all these levels, why can't we get all these various levels to play together nicely? We don't seem to. Somehow in our brains work remarkably well. And in some ways, our social life works remarkably well. For example, we have language. And language enables us to parallel process incredibly well, because I can ask you what happened and you can tell me, right? And it's much more efficient than you're dragging my ass over there and putting me through the same experience as you just had, which could be better than nothing, right? That could be way, way better than nothing, but it's not very efficient. Way more efficient is for you to process some things at a higher level with concepts that you've developed precisely to make short work, so to speak, of learning from experience. You don't have to learn from every experience de novo. You start to categorize things as, oh, I get it. This is like that again, right? And a long time ago, we used to draw pictures of those things. And then it turns out that words were much more efficient. And Tim Urban takes us through this sort of story, if I recall. I forget how much of it he does, but a lot of people take us through this story. So we are remarkable as a species, and as a species, we're thriving. And yet as a species, we're about to kill one another, right? And about to kill off our planet too. And so something's wrong here. So how are we processing information? Let's take a good look. Let's see. Let me introduce, just at the tail end of today, just a couple of new ideas with regard to information, and then we'll quit for today. New idea number one is what on earth is information? What do you mean by information? And what I mean by information is, I'm sort of laying down a little bit of a definition here. I don't mean precisely what you can, I don't mean Shannon information. If you happen to know that name, Shannon was a Bell Labs quantifier of information, and it's very much people know what Shannon information is in computer science. And there are other folks who have different accounts of what information is. Maybe information has something to do with entropy. So physicists have some idea what information is. And there are a lot of people, I can tell you this, who know a lot about information, who will tell you that information seems to have different senses, and they don't exactly know how to bring all those things together. And I'm recognizing all that and putting it aside for a moment. And I'm just going to tell you what I mean by information as we go forward. And I do think that it has something to do with all that other stuff, and maybe even we'll say something about it sometime, but I'm no expert in all that other stuff. There are experts. What I mean by information is the stuff we think about when we make choices. So don't throw that bag away. It's got your computer in it. If you didn't know that, if you wouldn't have thrown it away if you knew the computer was in it, right? Now, that's a piece of information for you. Thanks for telling me, you might say. That seems like it constitutes a reason for us to act differently in that set of circumstances. That that your computer's in that bag. Oh, then I won't throw that old bag away with the other old bags, right? I'll hang on to that one because of its contents. That's information that comes in through its visual at its roots, right? I mean, we see something, but it somehow isn't only visual in its roots because we know what that thing we see is. We have a story to tell about it. It's a computer. And we've got words for it, yes, but we have more than words for it. We know what to do with it, right? You can imagine someone learning that this shiny flat thing is a computer, is your laptop. You could imagine someone knowing the words, but having not the slightest clue as to what that thing is, right? But so we do have a slight clue. We know what that thing is. And where do we get it? Man, that's a complicated question, right? Where do we get all that information? Whatever it is that what we use to filter the world around us, and that don't throw it out. There's a computer in there. That's a reason for acting. Those reasons for acting are loaded with information, and we didn't all get it. We didn't get it all at once. That much is really very clear. We got it over a period of time. We learned what a computer is. We learned what this bright, shiny object was, etc. So for now, when we talk about information, let's think about reasons for acting and all of their roots. And if those, to get in to our conversation about information, so far as we think we know anything about it, we can sort of take it apart. We can retro-engineer the information that goes into our choices. At least in part, we can retro-engineer it, because we can take apart the various things that we see, the various things we see this as something, right? And we can, with our memory, we can take apart how we got to this place. Although I'm not suggesting that it's all introspection all the time. There's maybe a ton of things you have no idea. Introspection will not get you how you know certain things, how certain concepts got in your head, for example. You may, for example, ask your parents and they'll tell you, oh yeah, right, you got this, you started saying this when you were very young. Well, you can't remember that, right? But that might be part of the causal story, part of this layering up of concepts. So you might say on this model that to be information is to inform someone. It's something you are conscious about, or maybe it's something you could be conscious about. Does that mean that there aren't any factors that influence your choice that you aren't conscious about? No, I don't mean, I'm not trying, never say never. And in fact, I think we know that. Although it's an interesting question, if you could never be conscious about it and no one else could ever be conscious about it either, does it influence your choices? That's a good question. Are there influences on your choices which nobody in principle could ever be conscious about? That's an interesting question.
Seems like a pretty uninteresting question.
Pretty uninteresting because you could never know the answer, or
no, yeah, we could never know the answer, and no one else could ever know the answer.
That's an interesting epistemological point of wonder, right? Are there things to know?
It seems like definitionally it could not be interesting.
I don't know.
How could
it's interesting to imagine the possibility. I mean, suppose there were.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know.
I mean, suppose there are after all radio waves. There's electromagnetic radiation we don't pick up with our eyes, right? But we can build a detector for it, and eventually we can come to know it in that way. Okay. You might imagine, are there ways in which no, you can't build a detector for that, but you still interact with it? I don't know. How would you ever know?
Yeah.
Okay, so information then, that's what we mean by information. It's the stuff that you try to get before you make an ass out of yourself and your decisions. Okay, there's a very sloppy definition of information. And we recognize that you don't get that all at once. It's built up in you over time somehow. There are categories in your brain, and you filter the world through those categories. So, all right, I learned what computing is. That's part of the information. That's part of the information. That when someone tells me, don't throw that away, your computer's in that bag, then all the things you learned in the past are somehow woven into the information totality that is a reason why you don't throw that computer away. That would be a stupid thing to do.
Although
Okay.
something that I think is kind of funny to point out here is when you do go through the decision of, no, I'm not going to throw that bag away, it is like you're having, like, you do actually have that thought in your head where it's like, oh, I know that bag. That bag has my computer in it. I'm not going to throw that bag away. Like, who are you talking to in that moment? Like, and Sam Harris has a highly amusing chapter about stuff like this in his book Waking Up, where he goes through like, why do we just have this monologue in our heads with ourselves all the time, where we're just sort of like going over this information that we know, but who are we talking to? Like, if you just started saying all those thoughts like kids do, like, oh, blah 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 blah, this is happening, this block is doing this because of, it's like, anyway, I just think that could be something that would be fun to talk about at some point, is
It could.
like the fact that it seems like we are just talking to ourselves in our head all the time. Like that's just sort of our passive information processing. I don't know. I think that's interesting.
We may find ourselves either because we need to take a deeper dive in order to move forward to a next point. We may need, on that basis, we may want to dive into some things because we kind of have to, or we may just want to bring them up because, darn it, this is too interesting, and I don't want to only be an ordered basic learner my entire life. Today I want to think about this, right? Because there's something interesting, and I hope that our the structure of our meetings here allows for that some. So bring in Sam Harris, and those questions, any such questions, whether from Sam Harris or not, or insights, anytime. This is just the right time to bring him in. And then maybe we take a whole, maybe we, for example, dive into Wait But Why. Maybe we do the story of why one day, the story of us rather, someday. Or maybe we do Sam Harris's particular take once we see, that would tie in pretty nicely here. Or maybe just for fun. I want to leave with one other interesting point, and it's a very important point, I think, for understanding community. I want to make a distinction between information that shapes our choices through our processing that information consciously at some point in our life versus information that shapes our choices that, at least so far, has never gotten in our head consciously. You could say it wasn't our information from one point of view. You could say, I didn't know that, if someone brought that information to your mind. And I think this happens all the time, actually. There might be a reason why you're taking this drug and not that one, but that reason is in the physician's mind who prescribed it to you. There might be information that's relevant to why you're taking this particular drug and not that particular drug. There is information relevant to that, and you're making this choice. You're taking, at the very least, you're taking only these. And you might even have access, although typically we don't when it comes to drugs, not the best example, right? But you might have access. Somebody you know might be taking a different high blood pressure medication just to give it a real point. And you're taking the one you take. And the reason you're not taking the one you could take it, in fact, it's your wife's and she's got the pills right there. You could take them if you wanted to, but you don't. And the reason you don't, one might imagine, might be that there is information, there's a reason why, but the physician knows it and you don't. That's an interesting case. It might be the case that information that's relevant to your choices and that could even have causal impact on your choices doesn't have causal impact by informing you. I think I've just sketched such a case.
Yeah.
But
Is that different than parallel? That's different than parallel processing, though. That particular situation, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting. There was parallel processing in a certain sense, in the sense that you were worried about health matters. Who's taking care of your health? Well, both you and your physician are taking care of your health, but in different ways.
Yeah, I guess my question is more like, do you have to do the two processors have to be using the same information in parallel for it to be parallel processing, or can they be taking in different information but concerned about the same thing and processing it and coming out with some output?
Right. I think if you're doing it at the same time, the way the phrase parallel processing is used in computer architectures,
Yeah.
It could very well be that that this processor over here is also crunching numbers, but it's crunching a different subset of those numbers.
Okay.
Right. So yeah.
So that
you
would
got
be
processors and divide up your tasks, and and you might do those. Yeah. It
Okay.
might simply grab the first eighth, the second eighth, the third eighth, the fourth eighth, etc., and just distribute them, right? And have them all get crunched, as long as there's no dependencies. In other words, as long as you don't have to wait to add up this set of numbers before this other set of numbers is added up. Then you could parallel process them. And
cool.
so, yeah. So
That makes sense. I just wanted to make sure I understood what parallel processing means more generally.
Right. I'm not using it too rigorously. I think it is used the way I just used it. But you could imagine multiple people processing the exact same problem, the exact same way, because you might not get the same answer as somebody else. And when someone checks your work, for example, they might be working on exactly the same problem, and the two of you are, in a certain sense, parallel processing them. And what do you get from that? Well, if you have 10 of you do it and you all get the same answer, you're more likely to be right, you think. Right? So there are sometimes reasons for, doing it that way. Okay. Let me just drop another couple of examples out there, and then let me just end with a term here. I want to talk about making cognitive contact with information. This is what happens when you discover it and now you're aware of it. And that cognitive contact can be stretched out over time. So when someone tells you, hey, don't throw that out, this is one of these, this is a computer, for example, the cognitive story took place over a long period of time. If you'd never heard of a computer before, you'd say, what's that? Right? And it wouldn't constitute a reason for you. So that the information that comes to you cognitively might take place over a long period of time. It might trickle in over a long period of time, and somehow it's all processed now at this moment and gives you a reason not to act. But let me just throw the word, because it's an opposite, non-cognitive at it. So something's non-cognitive, and I'm not trying to be overly precise here, but I do think that if you don't know, if you've never considered that information, and yet it's impacting your choices, and it's part of the causal story for why your choice is what it is, then you might say you've come in contact with that information, but not cognitively, and I mean not your cognitively. Someone else may have it cognitively, but you don't. And it seems to me that we do this all the time. So you guys, I happen to know, because I taught at the school, went to the same school, right? You both went to Trinity School at Green Lawn, and somebody picked that curriculum. And somebody picked the books that you read when you read as a seventh grade kid, The Red Bat of Courage or something, right? Someone picked those books and it wasn't you. And that's another case. There, I suppose they're acting more like, when they craft a curriculum, they're acting a little bit more like a physician. Suppose they had read other books and they had chosen that book instead of these other books. And because it's better than these other books, for whatever reason, somebody made a selection and dropped it in the curriculum. I'm suggesting that you are in cognitive contact. The curriculum puts you in cognitive contact with the books that they read. But it puts you in contact with the books that they read, but not cognitively, not for you. You didn't read the books. You don't have reasons to prefer them. You might, if you happen to know, you might have a different type of reason. You might know, oh, these people are pretty trustworthy. They're well-read people, and they picked out what they thought were better books, and they left these other books aside, and that constitutes reason for me, right, not to read those books. That's why I read this one. You might be aware of that in that sort of meta way, but you're not directly aware of why it's a better book or that it is. You're sort of taking their word for it if you know about it, but you might not know about it, right? So let's back the case down. Imagine little kids who have a library at home, and there are books in the library, and as far as they know, for at least a little while, man, they can read anything. What would you like to read next, right? Imagine that. You've seen kids like that, right? They bring over stacks of books if they're fortunate. That's how they learn to read, right? They learn to read because reading is incredibly fun, and it's a great way to spend time with other people. And they go crazy, and they're surrounded by books if life goes well for them. And they don't have a thought in their head that these are books, but not other books. Not yet, they don't. And yet they're still benefiting. In it, whether they're benefiting or not is getting ahead of ourselves. Their choices are shaped, in fact, by other people's cognitive experience with other books. And it does not come through to cognitive experience of them, not directly. They didn't read the other books, and not through some shortcut where you get a story, you get a history, and you get some trust that's generated on the basis of that story. None of that might happen to that small kid for a period of time. But they are still in contact with all those other books. Now, could they be in contact with a lot of other books? Could they be, in a certain sense, well read? Could a very small child be very well read in this different sense? It's not that they've read a ton of books, but they've read some good books, and they haven't read some bad ones. And their choices are in that sense well read, because the books that are in front of them are at least thought to be better books by people who chose them. That's an interesting idea. And in any case, it seems like it's another example of non-cognitive contact with information about your options. These are books you could have read, small child, and these are the ones you are reading, right? And there is at the same time reason why you're not reading these other books. It could be,
yeah. That makes sense.
Trivial, or it could be significant. Okay. So now I guess I just want to leave the conversation thinking about how many other ways are there in which we're in non-cognitive contact with information. Because the more of them there are, the more we might be shaped by information without knowing it. Either without knowing it immediately, or maybe without knowing it in detail, if we come to know it eventually in some general way. One more piece, technology. You go into the store and you're going to buy a piece of audio equipment, and you read up a little bit on it. And you, John, I know you've built a speaker, John, and you did some research. You did your homework, but there's a lot of the technology you probably don't yet get. Right? The particular choice of materials, for example, why these materials rather than those other materials? What other materials? I don't even know what those materials are, or I don't know why they made those choices, except in general, in this audiophilic direction. I sort of presume that. get the impression that this Klipsch or Harman Kardon or, KLM or some speaker manufacturer designed these speakers based upon some material science, but I don't know anything about that material science. Another case. So somehow in technology, you can store information about what are better choices from you from an audiophilic end. If quality reproduction of sound, and what do I even mean by quality? Well, how about making it sound like the damn bird in the tree so I can't tell them apart, right? There I have something where I have some end in mind, and I might say, okay, this is at least
fidelity.
Or fidelity here to the concert experience, probably, right?
Yeah.
To the live concert experience or something like that, right? You want these two things to be alike: the band and the live band and the band you listen to, or the recording you listen to of it. So you pick all your stuff for that. In that technology, isn't there a non-cognitive contact with all kinds of information about your options? And doesn't that technology make your choices better? Better from some point, I don't mean better in every point of view, better in an audio fidelic. I'm making up that word, I don't think so. Right? If you're an audiophile, right, then, and what you are as an audiophile is you love music, right? And you want to replicate it, and you want it to be faithful, as you say, right, to the original experience. Then given that aim, their experience, the experience of technicians in this case, is woven into the technology. And non-cognitively to you. In fact, you may never have thought that hard about rubber and wires that wasn't used ever before in your life, right?
Yeah, I mean, does this apply? I mean, it seems like this is almost everything we interact with has this. I mean, like, I don't think about my phone. Like, we're making this call, and there's no way I could build a cell phone, right? There's no way there's no way I could build I could build hardly anything. Like, I don't know how to build. I don't know how to do very many things. I can't build very many things. And in the grand scheme of things, most of the things I interact with, I know almost nothing about.
Yeah.
I mean, I know some things about them, but most of the things about them, I don't know. I don't know. It seems like there's just a black hole here of like, yeah. I mean, fundamentally, there's tons of things I don't know that I interact with all the time.
I think so. And maybe more than you could know.
Yeah.
So maybe we're dependent on other human beings in a way because they knew. And presumably they're like us. What sounds good for them sounds good for us, right? We're building this craft around this end of high fidelity sound reproduction. And it's their experiences that make literally our options better. And their experience, it seems to me, then informs our options. It informs our choices. We choose differently because of their experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. We stand on the shoulders of giants, Uncle Tom.
I was hoping somebody would pull that out. Exactly. You remember Rosalind Franklin in the film? I think you both have seen the film. What's it called? The Race for the Double Helix.
I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, you haven't seen it? Goldblum is in it. What's his name? Jurassic Park. Richard.
Jeff Goldblum.
Jeff Goldblum is in it, and so are others. And it's the story of Watson, Crick, Franklin, and other eminent scientists whose names are escaping me at the moment. And you ought to see it. She makes that point. Says we stand on the shoulders of giants. You know that. She's talking about all of science and who gets credit for discovery. And her point is that, there's so much that's handed to us. X-ray crystallography in her case,
Yeah.
That was the thing. She was, yeah, she knew how to read them, and she probably didn't know how to make the instruments. Right? Somebody else
Yeah.
did that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is astonishing, and we certainly see it in science, but we might see it in education too. And that's why I started with the curriculum, the library. And we could ask the question: is all kinds of contact between other people's experiences and my choices might happen. All kinds of non-cognitive contact might happen. How would you even know where to start looking? You'd have to have some sense of your history, right? Who raised you? Who raised them? Right? Where does the wise and see love of pinochle come from anyway? Right? Or,
Yeah.
Somebody, family card game I happen to know. I ran into that before we were even born. So it's old. I know it's older than you.
Yeah.
So studying history can help us, but it can only scratch the surface, right?
Right. And we also
could-
don't want to just spend all our time reinventing the wheel.
Exactly.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So this is something we ought to think about for a bit, and we're going to think about it some more, because it obviously is a reason for living with other people, because apparently our choices can be impacted by other people's understanding of things. And sometimes, at least if we share the same ends as they do, and I suppose the same judgments about the same ends, right? We've got to both want to reproduce quality sound and both know it when we hear it. Right? Both of those things. So we need the same ends and the same recognition of whether means are the right means for the production of those ends. And if we had that, we could sure benefit from living with other people. Benefit, according to us, benefit in certain respects based upon the ends that we seem to have in common, that we identify as having in common. Of course, somebody might be shaping my choices for ends that I abhor. And that also we might want to discover.
Yeah.
I think that's the case. I mean, I could imagine we do things in certain ways, for example, to oppress other people. Maybe housing laws were written the way they were. Maybe the tax code was written the way it was to keep certain people from living in certain places. I never would have thought that. When I came to South Bend, Indiana, I remember the first time someone told me, there are no, the way I'll quote it exactly, there are no black people living in Mishawaka. What do you mean there are no black people living in Mishawaka? They can't. No one will sell them a house. And I said, that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I don't believe it. That's illegal. And then I talked to a guy, happened to be meeting with him. We were over breakfast, and our daughters were classmates. And he was just telling this fun story about how he moved this house. I forget how we got on the subject, but literally he was involved in moving a house. And he picked up a house from one place and they moved it and they put it in another place. It was an interesting story of moving the house. And he said, yeah, but that was the last house that guy ever moved. I said, how come? He said, well, they sold it to a black guy. In fact, I know the family they sold it to. I actually do know that family. And then he told me the story of how that was received. And that guy stayed up every night with a shotgun on his lap while people came by and tried to drive him out of the neighborhood. This neighborhood is right near Trinity School, by the way.
Wow.
And this guy was my age, and he did this move in high school, and that gives you some idea of the time frame we're talking about.
Yeah.
So in that world, you could imagine zoning laws.
Yeah.
And the reason they have zoning laws is the same reason that guy needed a shotgun when he bought a house, right? At the wrong time in the wrong place, he being of the wrong color. Those zoning laws might have been intended to keep people out of that place. And there's non-cognitive contact. We might inherit all that and we have no idea.
Yeah.
And we might participate in that system. So I just, that was an interesting story. I tell it. So, but I think that in the law also you get some your choices are shaped by other people's experience, and it might be for the better, and hell, it might be for the worse.
Yeah.
And how do you know? These are good questions. All right, so this is what information is. And obviously, if we're going to talk about how do we optimize information processing at all these various levels, we better know something. We better think for a while about not only information that flows in that way cognitively, but we better think for a while about information that flows in non-cognitively. It's a great way for information to contact us. It enables us to work together on great big tasks. But if we don't know what those tasks are, or we don't share in those tasks, it may end up helping us, it may end up hurting us if we're going to build a high information flow network of rich communities that processes information very well. We're going to have to figure these things out.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for listening to that. A little bit longer than I said we would go. A lot longer. But you got this cool story. I'll show you the house. I'll show you the house sometime, or I'll tell it to you off camera.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Thanks, dudes.
Cool.
Alrighty.
Yep.
What's so next meeting Monday?
I think we're going to run back to Monday, Wednesday, Friday, unless we have reasons not to. Try and stay on that schedule, and we're going to stay at the same, slightly half-hour earlier time, unless we have reasons not to.
Perfect.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Excellent.
Yeah. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
Yeah, thanks, Uncle Tom. All right. 5:40.